welcome everybody to this webinar with the Swedish Australian Chamber of Commerce. And we do have a special guest keynote speaker here today, which is Professor Göran Roos. And we also have Figge Boksjö from our Perth chapter, who will be leading our Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And if you have any questions, which we hope you do, we prefer if you write your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will answer, or Göran will answer your question live. We have a feedback survey which will pop up at the end of the webinar. So please it will only take a few minutes, but it would be really good if you fill that in and we can get your feedback on how we can improve our webinars. I will present a little bit after the webinar, also our upcoming events for the next few months. I hand over to you now, Figge.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Camilla. And it's a great privilege for us to have Professor Göran Roos here at our fingertips, I call it. Göran has more titles and accomplishments and credentials that we have time for in this seminar. So in short, Göran is an FTSE, which is a fellow Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. It's a very prominent title awarded to about 900 fellow peers organization. It's an academy of independent experts helping Australians to understand and use technology to solve complex problems. So Göran, raised in Sweden, Swedish, and graduated from Chalmers, and I believe you've lived in Adelaide or in Australia for about 7 years, if I'm not wrong. Then you moved back to the UK recently, and that's where you live with your family at the moment. So Göran has been with us, and we've been privileged in WA to have a few events where you have been a keynote speaker. Latest was last year. We had a very interesting one that we called the new normal of what's going to happen with the implications for the mining industry, moving from low resource footprint to the new paradigm that we have. Very, very interesting, and was so appreciated. So we're very glad to have Göran back with us. So for today's session, we'll be free from the value statements and all political spins, just facts and conclusions. We will hear the present state of the economy and the new normal with the implication for the resource extraction industry. So in contrast to mainstream media, planting those clickbaits in headlines and extracting quotes and video clips out of context, it'd be very nice to this time hear a bit more facts and insights from a scientific perspective. So it's not a moderated session, this is a presentation, and I will leave it up to Göran to run this, and we'll run the Q&A in the end, as Camilla said. So welcome, Göran. Thanks for logging on from the UK, delivering an exciting session today. Please tell us about the present state of the economy and what is the new normal for Australia's economy that is so dependent on this resource extraction industry. Welcome, Göran.
Thank you, Figge. Thank you very much. And I flipped on my little slides. The good thing about talking about the future is that you know you're going to be wrong. So the question is not about that. The question is how wrong you're going to be. And of course, there are many people looking at these things. What I've tried to do is to put together a number of slides there with some facts and some conclusion about what we know at the moment. A, where we are, and B, where we are likely to be in the future, and something about those timelines. And in that, I will also talk a little bit about the extractive industries in the broader sense. But of course, we will also talk about some of the industries that will be more affected than the mining industry in this area. So the first thing I'd like to say is a little bit around this phases and where we are focusing on. So normally when you go through something like this, there is about 5 phases as a country, as in a company. And we got all the shock. We stopped in some countries. We stopped completely for some while. We are basically at the moment trying to restart the economy, and as many people are in these countries realize that's much more difficult than to stop it. And then we are looking to return to a new normal. And unfortunately, the emphasis on the political side in many of these countries have been mostly on the restart rather than on the return to the new normal. And the return to new normal is actually more complex than the restart, which is complex enough in this area. So if we look at the OECD latest forecast, we can see that generally speaking, we are going to take quite a while for us to get back to where the new normal is going to be. And basically, in the beginning, there was a lot of optimism around a V-shaped recovery. And I think at the moment, the general consensus is that it's going to be more what I call a Nike swoosh recovery. In other words, it's a deep, quick bottom up and then a very slow recovery. And you can see that it's going to take, many, many years before we are back to where we were, and even longer until we're back where we ought to be in this scenario. And this will have a number of consequences. And to look specifically at what the forecast is for Australia, and this is, people talk about single hit and double hit, and that double hit issue is around whether we'll get a second wave before we have a vaccine developed in this area. So I've looked primarily at the single wave, not to be too pessimistic about these things. And we can see that the Australian drop was about 40% in GDP. And then we're looking at an increase, but the increase is not going to bring it back instantaneously. And it will take some while again in Australia before it comes back, in spite of the fact that Australia belongs to the group of countries which has a very low direct hit of the COVID virus. And this is a little bit about where we see the employment scenario. And like in all these economic shocks, employment is a laggard. So it takes much longer for employment to come back than it comes for the economy to come back. And I have marked here the Australian numbers on top in yellow. So you can see that we're going from a kind of a 5% unemployment situation to about an 8+% employment situation as the forecast looks in the beginning of 2020. And that is, that's a pretty substantial increase. Now, it is nothing like Spain, which you can see at the lower end of the table, where you're going to hit up to about 20% plus as an overall employment scenario. And of course, that means in some sectors, you're going to have substantially more than 50% of staff unemployed, primarily among the young people. And this level of unemployment, apart from causing misery for individuals, will of course have national effects. It causes issues around crime, it causes issues around mental health, and it causes general disturbance issue in the economy. So this is going to be actually quite a large issue for many countries to try to deal with. And if you look at some of the sectors that are impacted, and many of you will know this, the one that stands out is generally anything that has to do with accommodation, food, tourism, travel, those type of areas. And if we look at the UK data, you can see that 80% reduction in the number of people employed in the accommodation and food industry as we speak now. They are all furloughed, so they are 80% of their salary paid by the government. Many of those people will not have a job to come back to when the furlough system stops in August, because these companies will not be in business. And that is one of the key issues or driver of this unemployment. So we're looking at quite a substantial decrease in specific sectors, which frequently is hidden when you look at the overall numbers for a country. So if you look at this money that has been invested, because most countries have invested a substantial amount of money in order to deal with these areas. I mean, for example, the Australian surplus has gone for many years on the budget scenario, but you can also see that the general increase in the debt level as compared to GDP is quite substantial overall. And keep your eye on the blue one, because that is the single hit scenario. And you can then look across and see that, for example, in the US, we're looking at an increase in the debt equal to 1/4 of GDP. Now, that is a not insignificant amount of money. And that means that we have now spent a lot of money, which will not be allowed and available to spend on other things. Plus the fact that we've taken on a huge amount of debt that needs to be repaid. So this is quite substantial issues. And by the way, if anybody you're desperately taking screenshots or making notes, don't worry, you will get a copy of these slides afterwards. So if you then look at, okay, what are the GDP impacts and what are they built on? They're basically built on three things. There is, and I want to convert this for a moment, this picture into a table, which makes it somewhat easier to look at. So the it is built on a direct effect. In other words, country closed down and that stopped the economy. So there is a direct effect. Then there is an effect on the issue that global value chains got disrupted. That means that even if some things, would have wanted to stay open, they can't in that scenario. So there's a number of global value chain effect issues. And then there is an effect, a kind of general equilibrium effect that the economy globally has kind of settled on a lower level, and that can be either a positive or a negative effect depending on which country you are. So you can see it, countries that close down, Australia and a few other countries, obviously have a very large direct effect on the gross national income scenario. Whereas Sweden is an interesting example on which the jury is still out, whether it's good or bad strategy, did not close down, and therefore the direct effect is zero by definition. But it's still hit by the, being an export-oriented country, it will still be hit by the global value chains that were disrupted and made companies have to stop their operations in this scenario. So looking at this, we can then see what the breakdown effects are. And the second column, so in other words, the global value chain column, is a direct reflection of how export or import dependent a country is. So how integrated is the economy in the global economy. And I'll come back to that when I talk a little bit about China later on, because you can see that China, of course, got a large direct effect, and then it still has a global value chain effect. And China and Chinese product export will be hit long term by a general change in how companies structure their supply chains moving forward, because there is a realization that there has been a focus on efficiency for many, many years at the expense of resilience. And now many companies are trying to up the resilience of their supply chain, and that will be at the expense of some efficiency. So that means that will be a little bit more expensive to keep your operations going, but on the other hand, you will be more resilient. And that means that you will diversify away from China, even if it's only a 20% backup type scenario in your supply chain. So that is something that is going to impact China. I'll come back to that. You can also see the trade effects, and I just outlined the mining and quarrying activity here in some countries, where you can see that the export, declined from quite a lot of them by definition, since they were closed down, but also import declined because we had a lot of companies that no longer operated, so they needed no raw material. So, and this you can look at for all the different sectors, but of course this is part of the general shock that you see in their economies, that there has been some major shifts, and not all of these will be back to the level they were, and some of them will be back higher. And the interesting factor is that the sectors that really created major problems for economies in the close down issue are service sectors. So the service sector is the one that has fallen, and most of that is actually it's only a minority of services that are exported. So in the export and import data, services are a very small component, whereas in their domestic economies, they are a very large component. And the total decline in services is actually quite substantial as we see it for 2020. And that is one of the issues that is going to worry governments on how you restart these type of activities if you don't have a domestic demand for your domestic suppliers of different service activities. And some industries are, and I'll mention a bit later on, but some industries will definitely look at being nationalized. Airline industry is one of those. They will not be able to supply without de facto being nationalized moving forward. They cannot supply given the long-term effects on that sector. US is probably the most worrying case. It's completely unprepared as an economy to deal with these scenarios. In spite of having done the scenario many times, they were not able to put it in place. It's a late, as you see, an uncoordinated response. The healthcare system really, it's an interesting view of the US, because on the one hand you have an unprepared healthcare system that really struggled, for example in New York, to deal with the cases. At the same time, numerous hospitals fired nurses and doctors en masse because they did not deal with this type of care, and since they are private, they could not afford to keep them on if the economy in that state was closed down. So you have a parallel scenario where there is a deficit of nurses and doctors at the same time as you fire into unemployment numerous doctors and nurses. And this is an example of the uncoordinated structure that the US have. There's been a rapid contraction of the economy, and the numbers don't sell the whole area. And you see a very expensive intervention. So basically, during this period, the Federal Reserve has been buying, basically $1 million of debt per second in this period. And you start then to understand the huge amount of money that has been borrowed and that has to be repaid in the system. You can't inflate around and inflate away a lot of this debt. And yes, it is likely that the recovery will be swoosh-shaped in this scenario. So, and it has to do with the reluctance for business to do certain things. There will be persistent behavioral changes. There's a number of issues that will drive this issue. And one of the things the government will have to do is that you will risk ending up with a lot of companies that are no longer have the ability to do more than survive. They just be able to literally roll over to pay their debts. I mean, 40+% of UK companies taking government loans in this period will not be able to repay them. So you're looking at companies that basically will be deadwood. And that means in order not to tie up those resources, those people, government will have to start doing industrial euthanasia. They will have to start to help those companies to die in a meaningful way, to reallocate the resources that now are tied up in those companies that are not productive enough, because they're never going to get out of this hole that they've been put into. And that's a really difficult decision and a really difficult discussions in the political area. And as we said, there are many issues that will be impacted, and we just took at one of them before I go in a little bit on the extractive sector, but that is airlines. So a 1% reduction in corporate travels has a 10% impact on airline profits. And now we have a dramatic decline to a very low level of corporate travel, and it's not going to pick up for quite some time. And that means most airlines are actually not going to be able to survive as they are at the moment. Either they need enormous debt relief and borrow money from government. We see, Lufthansa, for example, being a case like that. And that means that they de facto are nationalized because government will become the largest shareholder in these companies. And many airlines will likely go bankrupt in this transition period. It also means there will be cross-subsidization effects, so air freight will become very expensive compared to what it has been, because cross-subsidization of these things will no longer take place. Airfares will go up because you're not cross-subsidized by the enormous amounts of people in the front paying for the even larger amount of people in the back. So there is a whole host of issues that flow from this airline issue and the lack of business travel, which will last for quite some time. The global value chain scenarios, so supply chains, have actually accelerated the shocks in some of these countries quite dramatically. Sometimes we can ask if the cure that the countries have implemented are worse than the disease. And I have a few quotes here that I think are really important to reflect on. The first one is that yes, disease kills people, but the absence of likelihood also kills people. So far in the UK, the number of people directly killed by non-disease close down effects are lower than the people killed by the disease, but not by a lot. Right. So you can ask some interesting issues around that. And long term, unemployment kills people, and we're now going to have a huge amount of unemployment. And the net effect, when you look at the cost to the economy by the net number of lives saved, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars per life saved when you look at a 2 to 3 year perspective. So you do wonder sometimes around this. And this is the first time in the history of our economies that we have decided that the value of a human life is infinite, as opposed to having the normal amount of money that you use in government calculations, or maybe $50,000 to $150,000 per life year when you look at straightening roads or doing other types of investments. So now the life has been valued infinite, and that is really interesting because it will have numerous consequences. So for individuals, this has been very difficult. You know, we have lockdown, and that changes people's behavior, and some of those behaviors will stay, as we will see shortly. And this is a relatively simple picture. For companies, it is substantially more complicated. As you can see, there are numerous causalities here. So there are, you know, increasing work from home, there are increasing business failures, there is increased unemployment, you know, there's reduced demand for goods. There's a number of issues in this picture, which I'm not going to go through, but the specific causality links is sector specific. But for some sectors, this is really complicated and it will dramatically change the operating environment. For others, it's fairly straightforward and, you know, relatively easy to get back. So you can look at what companies will do in response. So, you know, there is a recent survey in the UK, and we can see of, you know, what will companies do? Well, basically capital expenditure will be delayed, reduced, or terminated. And that will, of course, have implications for all the people who supplied those things that they intended to buy. And a lot of companies are going to make people redundant once the furlough scheme goes off. And this is no different from other countries, albeit the UK has probably handled the pandemic virus the worst of all the OECD countries. It still, as a principle, stands for most countries on what will happen. And some sectors have behaved incredibly badly. One of them is the fashion industry, which has created huge economic suffering in countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and other areas by not only immediately canceling orders, but also refusing to pay for the raw material and the finished goods that were all ready to ship. They have basically just walked away. And that means that there is a lot of factories that are dying with the associated livelihood issues in these countries. And that's an illustration of where a very uncaring and economically driven, to a level not necessarily needed, decision by one sector has dramatically impacted the supply chain and the countries dependent for their livelihood on that supply chain. And you can read that at your leisure, but it illustrates what maybe we should not be so proud about in terms of some of the behaviors that some sectors have done. So for the extractive industries, yes, you know, you've been exposed to a number of these things. You know that there is a decline in oil, and the little tough between Russia and OECD about oil accelerated that price decline about that. There is also an issue around, you know, what sectors of the extractive industries are going to be declining in terms of demand, what are going to increase in demand, given the volumes of economic activity that may or may not arise again after the opening up. And I'm sure you all have modeling inside your house that decides what you think your specific sector is going to happen here. So if you look at then what does this new normal that we're coming into, and I'll say a few words at the end, what does it mean for the mining industry? Well, actually, if I'm blunt, not an enormous amount. You know, it's basically procedural, you know, because you are isolated communities in a lot of the extractive industries, and that means that you've been just, you know, putting in place a little bit new procedures. Well, and you've done it very well. You've done, you know, you increase your communication issues. You have, you know, basically continued your automation, digitalization activities, maybe at a tiny faster pace. And the key thing you may have been struggling with is the impact that this has had on your suppliers and contractors, because they may not have been allowed on site any longer. They may not have been allowed to travel. So that means that they have had to accelerate dramatically the remote activities that they have already been involved in. And those suppliers who have not been able to operate remote will be the one who are going to struggle in coming out of these things. But there will also be some positive issues. And I lifted a quote by Rio Tinto's CEO here, You know, he had a recent meeting in May where he made some statements. And basically, he's basically saying we suddenly show that we can do things. You know, we thought it would take years and we could do it in weeks, and we have locked in some dramatic improvements, and we want to be able to lock those in for the future as well. So there has been some clear benefits by forcing the organization to respond and then seeing what could be done that nobody actually thought was quite possible, and now see if those benefits can be locked in. Now, some countries are talking about should we give people tax holidays and other things to help them come back? And when it comes to the extractive industry, the answer is basically no. This is what a very long slide says. Basically, no. And there is a lot of reasoning why that is the case. You can look at that yourself. So there can be some temporary support, but it is a deferral rather than a denial of income to government in this area. There is an impact that the mining industry may be able to benefit in sectors, and that is that a lot of countries are now looking at this green domain as a way to restart the economy. And that means that, and you can look at that specifically in the first mover countries, which have been Norway and Germany, where a lot of money have been spent to accelerate the transition of the economy into a green world. And that means that we're looking at increased demand for those raw materials that are needed to a higher extent in a green environment than in a non-green environment. And that is an opportunity for mining, but it's also an opportunity for the recycling, because without the growth or recycling of some of these materials, there won't be enough for this transition to take place. So there is a number of opportunities arising out of what is a growing trend among many OECD countries to use government as a regulatory and procurement driver of a transition into a green operating world. And I would, if I were you, I would keep a close eye on what happens primarily in Norway and Germany as a benchmark for how that will possibly roll out across many countries. And the government plays an enormous role as both a customer and an investor in these activities. Yeah, you can look at that yourself. And this brings us back to China, which is exciting because a lot of these materials that are needed in the green issue are controlled to a great extent by China. And they have, as many of you know, over the last 10 to 15 years, built up a controlling stake on purpose in many of these materials in order to have an OPEC type control of the pricing of these materials for what they see as the green future. And this has, of course, led to many other activities in the world where, for example, US and Australia has come to an agreement where the US finance certain explorative activities to identify new sources of these materials in Australia. So what are the aspects of the new normal that we see as critical? Well, firstly, there will be an increased speed and penetration of labor market automation, and that would be task automation. I want to emphasize this. You don't replace people by automation as such, but you replace tasks that people do with automation. So some people would have some of their tasks automated and other people will have many of the tasks automated. We have seen during this pandemic working from home environment that actually working from home is quite doable, much more than people thought. And also we identify that many of the lower level managers, those on first level of management, have not been needed in the domains where they primarily have been task allocating as their main operating activity. We don't need them. People have been able to allocate their own tasks. So that means we're looking at a kind of a delayering of that first layer happening as a consequence of this increased task automation. I spoke about the supply chain diversification that is taking place as we speak, and that will have some interesting effects. We are looking at relocalizing or restructuring supply chains. People are looking at getting some critical components back into proximity of their prime activities, and in that proximity operating within countries who have proven themselves to be trustworthy and not locking down domestic industries, even they are foreign owned, for their own domestic benefit. One of the countries that have suffered reputation-wise for this is France, which locked down a number of subsidiaries of foreign companies in order to force them to deal with the French situation rather than fulfilling committed contracts of supply to countries outside. So that has implication of the view that companies then hold on where we can put things and where we cannot put things. There is going to be, as a consequence, this a kind of a global decoupling. We can say that globalization is, if not slowing down, maybe even reversing quite dramatically. And that means that we're going to have more sectorial and geographical protectionism coming to the surface in this scenario. There will be a change in trust towards, the public domain, and some of that trust will be higher and some of it will lower, depending on looking back of the outcome and how people feel they are treated. And in many countries, climate change policy will either be used as a restructuring activity, Norway, Germany, or will be delayed, as in the US, and derailed. You do know some of the rules that Trump has now implemented that allows you to pollute as much as you want in order to get economic recovery. And, people will become much more schedule flexible. People will be allowed to work from home. There will be, the offices will still remain, but they will be different. Yes, we will mostly go back to our offices, not all of us, but most of us. But the office will be different, both in its layout and its operating procedures. We look at it as a project office rather than as a work office. And, as long as you know other people, you can communicate digitally. If you don't know them, you still need to meet them first, but there is an issue. So the demand for office space is going to be different. And those companies who have recently invested in borrowing money to build a new office building according to the old style may be a little bit in trouble doing that. Changing work patterns, I have some numbers which you can go through, but there will be more people that will work from home. And they will work from home more of the time. And that will have implications for commuting activities, for efficiency, effectiveness, and for private work-life balance issues. And for consumers, there are three things that we see is happening very clearly with a long-term effect. People are going to be much more worried for quite a long time. So precautionary savings, falling consumption rates, and increasing frugality will stay. And we have a whole generation of those people either just on the way out of education or just recently out of it, who will be out of a job and who will struggle to get into the labor market. And they again means that they won't have any money to spend. Online shopping is really dramatic. We've seen, for example, people in the 70+ category who previously did not shop online has now become the most rapidly increasing group for shopping online, and they're not going to change. They're going to keep shopping online. This has huge implication for shopping centers and shops. And, we are moving to cashless because people don't want to touch notes any longer. So the acceleration to cashless is happening. And we can see, as I said, the decline in these type of issues moving forward. And government will have to institute debt to equity swaps for those companies they want to keep, like airlines, for example, whereas not letting the other ones fail. And you want to be in a law firm, so accounting firm that deals with bankruptcy is going to have a lot of work moving forward in many countries. The final word is about these global power shifts. China is now looking at a great opportunity of increasing its influence across the world, which it is taking. And it's doing that partly because of its strength and partly because the basically retreat of the US across the world. And especially Australia will be exposed to this. You can see it in your proximity area, where what China is doing in Indonesia, PNG, and the Pacific Island nations and Thailand is very visible, and how they are trading money for political influence and a real impact on what they want to achieve. They've also dramatically changed their wording and their rhetoric around the absorption of Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, where for the first time ever, the recent political conference in China removed the word peaceful from the statements of how to incorporate Taiwan into China or reincorporate Taiwan into China. And you can see that that China is using the opportunity for acquiring companies around the world, if they're allowed to, that holds critical resources, IP or minerals or whatever it may be, and how they are also penalizing countries whose rhetoric they do not like, either by very outspoken ambassadors who make threats to the countries, which you've seen in UK, you've seen it in Sweden, or by activities or what we might euphemistically call state-sponsored actors in the digital domain, of which Australia has been a target recently. These things you can see continuing as we move forward. So the world is changing. Australia has been spared, but do not believe that that will make it any less impactful on Australia. And it's more the fact that Australia are going to find it more difficult to adapt for precisely the reason that it hasn't been badly hit, whereas those countries that have been badly hit will, find it easier to change. That is me finished very rapidly. You will have the slides. You can go through some of the facts and the sources for your own reasons, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you may have.
Thank you very much, Göran. That was very interesting indeed. There's a lot of insights there that I think are based on facts and science rather than political views, and it's really nice and refreshing to have that. So thank you very much. We have had a couple of questions coming in, so I will put one forward straight away. We got that from Kieran Schneeman from AstraZeneca, so that's very nice. He starts off saying a terrific presentation, Göran, thank you. So the massive debt, this is about the debt, and you mentioned about the countries. Who are the beneficiaries? Who are the lenders? And there's a follow-up question on that one. And what is the impact of those economies?
Who lends money to countries? Well,
yes. How do you balance a debt?
Well, there are basically three ways, and I simplify it, and I apologize to anybody from the financial services sector here, but I will simplify it brutally. So you can, in order to get money, you can either print it yourself, right? Literally. And that is part of what is happening. And countries at the moment don't have a problem with that because printing money drives inflation. And actually, we need inflation because that is part of how you inflate away the debt as you move forward. So printing the money themselves in this simplistic term is one area. The other area is you borrow it from your own citizens. And that is actually quite interesting because statistically, in many statistical look at debt, you don't count when you borrow from your own citizens. You do that by premium bonds and equal type of services. You can borrow that from your citizen, and you borrow on the international bond markets where you raise bonds. And there are, if you look at the world, there are net lenders and net borrowers. So examples of countries that are net lenders are those with a national fortune. And two examples of those would be Norway and Taiwan. So both of those have a huge surplus of cash, if I in simplistic term, which they then lend to others, in return for the normal interest. And there are several countries which have this net surplus, and don't confuse the daily account. So Norway, as a classic example, has a problem with their budget deficit, but that is separate from the fact that they sit on a very large cash pile. Because you separate those oil revenues, they are outside the budget flow. They get saved straight away into the oil fund, if I use a simplistic term. Whereas they're non-allowed government to take money above a certain level from the oil fund means that they sometimes run a deficit in their budget, but they still have a very large savings account in the bank. And that savings account can then be used to buy bonds, national bonds, as well as shares in companies. So the answer is there are very simplistically these three ways in which you raise money.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. There was a follow-up. The impact of this economy, who will be able to service that debt, let alone pay back?
Yes. If you want to follow that debate, you can follow the debate that takes place within the European Union at the moment, right, around how to support the Mediterranean members of the European Union, primarily Spain, Italy, and Greece. Now, Greece is so small, so it doesn't really matter as an economy. But if you look primarily at Italy, it's a very large economy in Spain, where there has been a suggestion from the European Union that money needs to be donated to this country, whereas the country who are net contributors to such a donation, which is whose voice is carried by what is known as the Frugal Four, which is Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands, and Austria, have said, we can lend you money, but we are not going to give it to you because we don't believe you can manage these properly. So so what you normally say is, as a country, if you have a national debt, and careful about how you calculate it, but your debt level is give or take 30 to 40%, you are optimally leveraged, as a company would have expressed it. Right. Once your debt level hits 100%, you're starting to become at risk. And of course, that is a function of what the interest level is at your debt. But once your debt payments, interest and repayments, reach the level where no money is left over for anything else, by definition, a country can no longer function. And that is when you tend to leave it over to the IMF to step in, which we see now and then in third world countries.
Yeah. It's interesting and scary, I suppose. Thanks for that. I do want to move over to another question we got from Josef Olsson here in Perth. Very interesting, he says, possibly scenarios for Australian industries such as mining on the ongoing trade, he uses the name trade war between US and China. What's your take on that one?
Well, Australia has the unenviable position of being dependent on China for much of its trade revenues, and dependent and aligned with US for much of its security activities. And this is an extremely difficult position. I would not want to be in the political seat of making decisions of how to maneuver what will be an increasingly difficult situation, where the monetary pressures that can be applied by China are likely to increase, whereas where the security issues of the US are fraught with uncertainty and are highly dependent on what the outcome of the US election is later this year. So it's not going to get better short term, it's rather going to get worse, would be my view.
Yeah. No, I think we kind of see that too. Thank you very much. Yes, please come in with some questions. So that was the last one we had from the Q&A board. I did have one little question that came up before we spoke about this. It's in regards to economics on the stock market. So why have stock markets risen so much from the lows in March, even though a global economy has ended and headed to a very deep recession? Are those heading for a big fall, or what's going on there?
Well, the stock markets, once upon a time, and in Australia still, people are taught that economic behaviors are rational, and that the stock markets reflect all information at a given time around prices. Behavior economists don't generally believe that. They believe that people are irrational, and I think you can see that in some behaviors. The kind of panic buying of loo papers was not necessarily a rational activity by many people. So stock markets react. Stock markets is about net present value of future cash flows. Mm-hmm. So they react to what their belief is around the future. So they are not reacting to what's happening today very much. They are reacting on what the implications of the actions today are for cash flows tomorrow. So that is why when governments state that they're going to give new relief to companies, the stock market will say, oh, good, that means that a company's cash flows are going to be better over the future, a larger group of companies will survive, and that's generally a positive thing, so they will drive an up. That's also why they say that when a new vaccine is being fast-tracked and maybe ready, they then react positively, because that means that consumer confidence in the economy come back once the vaccine is out, and that means that future cash flows are going to get better. So apart from specific sectorial issues, which basically are based on the same principle, the stock market is all about the future. hence the view has been there was a review of the investor community, in other words, these money managers, about how they view the recovery. And they were given 3 choices. They were given a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, and a W-shaped recovery if there is a second wave. They were not given the swash alternative at the time. The overwhelming majority at that quite recent study believed in a V-shaped recovery. And if you believe in a V-shaped recovery, then it's the down point on the stock exchange is an opportunity for buying, which buys prices because of future issues. Now, if you are wrong, you will lose money on that, of course. So there is a whole issue here about the rationality of behavior of these things. And also, don't forget, most trades on the stock exchange are not made by people who are value investors. In other words, it's not made by people who look at the value of the underlying asset. They are made by arbitrage dealers whose only issue is that they want that underlying asset to change in value. They don't really care if it goes up or down. They just want it to change in value. And that means that when uncertainty is high, these people trade a lot, and that trade itself drives price issues. So there are all kinds of complexities around the stock exchange, but don't look at the stock exchange as an indicator of a rational view of what the future will hold.
Interesting. Yep. No, thank you very much for that. We're moving forward a little bit on the stimulus that people have, or the government. So Theresia Fors in our Brisbane chapter there, she's got a question interesting. With given the government's investment boom, we are seeing that there are a way to predict the economic activity this investment will generate. Simply put, would you be able to say that with every dollar invested in infrastructure, etc., you will create $2 of economic activity?
The answer is yes. Yes, you can. All OECD countries have national models. Simplistically put, their input-output models. So they are a very, very large matrix where if you put money into one sector, it says what does the sector spend it on, so all this cross flows. So from that area, you can say, okay, how much a dollar invested in sector A, how much will that generate in purchased material in these sectors? How much will it generate in terms of salaries paid to workers? And then you can go back and say, and how are these workers going to use this money? Are they going to buy petrol? Are they going to buy food? What amount? How much are they going to share? So there is we call these kind of spillover effects, and they are direct from input-output table. They're indirect 1 level, and they're indirect 2 levels. So you can actually make these calculations quite clearly. I did it myself when I looked at the implications of buying a submarine overseas, whereas building it in Australia, and looked at exactly how these material costs flow to which, where, and where. So the very short answer is yes. And if you want to have access to that model, you can either go directly to your state government. They will have an economics department who have access to their state model, or you can go to the federal department's economics department and the statistical area, and they carry these models and can actually make these calculations in quite some detail. Now, like all models, as the famous state, all models are wrong, but some are useful. This type of model belongs to the useful category. It's not going to be exactly right, but it's going to give you a pretty good indications of where, in which sector spending $1 would have the biggest impact on their economy.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting, and I think that gave Teresa a good answer. We're also opening up, so if you do have a question, please raise your hand in the chat there, and we'll maybe be able to let you in. Just got one question through the Q&A chat here. It's Tobias Lindsjö. Very interesting webinar. You mentioned a future increased focus on renewables and also increased domestic manufacturing to secure the supply chain. Is it safe to assume that we will see more Australian manufacturers of equipment for renewables sector, like fuel cells, energy storage, wind turbines, etc.?
So the question has 2 parts, and they actually have completely different answers. So
okay,
yes and no. I'll get back to that.
Yes. Start with the first one.
Yeah, start with the first one. So the answer is Yes, there's a realization in many countries that they have allowed themselves to be dependent on global supplies of products that actually are critical, and when they are not available global, they have lost the ability to produce them domestically. So there, and that means that a number of work groups in a number of countries have been involved in identifying how to rebuild, let's call it sovereign manufacturing capability. So how can we make personal protection equipment? How can we make certain pharmaceuticals? How can we make certain medical equipment? So in many countries, there is an emphasis on rebuilding the capabilities to do these things. And that is, of course, not an easy thing to do. If you sit in Germany, you can make most things, but you sit in other countries that may not have that sophisticated industrial base, it's quite difficult. So it then becomes an issue about how critical is it and how much are you willing to pay? And will these companies, once established, be able to export successfully to earn back the investment the government made in them, in addition to the risk premium the government is willing to carry because they now have it domestically, rather than being dependent on non-functioning imports. So the answer is yes, we will see a rebuilding of manufacturing in many countries. The second part, will we see more manufacturing of specific things in a given country, be that green things or other things? The answer is, it depends on whether the capability exists to make those things locally. So when you think about a complex scenario, there are maybe, so let's look at the role. So let's take my little submarine examples. There will be, to build a submarine, you need a lot of components. This system requires a lot of things. Some of them are quite simple, like a deck chair, and some of them are rather complex, like a sonar system. So if you then say, okay, what of these things do we have the capability to build in our country? And if you are in France, you may be able to build 100%. If you are in Australia, you may be able to build 10 or 15% if you are lucky. That means that if you try to establish something for which the underlying capability in country do not exist, those companies cannot exist there. In order to survive, they need to have access to all the things necessary to them. So if you establish them locally, they will migrate somewhere else where they have access to these things. So you need to build up your capability stepwise. In other words, industrial development is path dependent, as we say in technical terms. So what you can do tomorrow is a function of what you do today. So the answer is we can do some of these things, and don't make the confusion of having huge capabilities in university. Don't equal that with being able to make those things, because there's a huge step between being able to develop a new fuel cell in a lab bench at the university and being able to manufacture it with all the capabilities that are required for that on scale in a factory. So, which is why Australia is a net exporter of know-how from universities to countries which are able to convert them into industrial products, right? And then Australia re-import those industrial products. So the answer is, in some of those specific sectors, yes, it is possible for Australia to produce things. In others, the answer is no, not within the foreseeable future.
Interesting. And I remember we talked about this during the green seminar we had, how we send things over. You had the log example there from New Zealand. You send them over and buy them back in different furnitures and stuff. Very interesting. Thanks. I hope Tobias got the answer he wanted for that. Let me go to Sten Söderström, who's got a question in regards to currencies. How do you view the future of the role of the US dollars versus gold as a safe haven currency? And he remembers when the US dollar was $38 for an ounce. What do you think? Is there a risk with the US dollar?
There is again an irrational and a rational component to this.
Yeah.
The US dollar is a world currency definition. There are third-party countries in their internal trade will use the US dollar as the currency of change, the currency of pricing, and so on. The ability to keep liquidity on a national level in many countries in order to do that, these state national banks like Reserve Bank of Australia needs a swap facility with the US Federal Reserve so they can issue domestic dollars and swap their own currency to do that. So there are actually almost more dollars floating around outside the US and issued outside the US for use than there is inside the US for use inside the US. So the dollar will for the foreseeable future continue to be the world currency, and only part of that issue relates to the size and function of the US economy. A lot of it relates to the fact that it is being built into de facto the world currency that underpin most other issues. So the decline of the US dollar as a world currency, I think, is unlikely in the foreseeable future.
Okay.
Gold is more of an irrational issue, and the gold pricing is much more difficult. It's frequently cultural based. Some countries view gold as the only reliable and the stable source of wealth that they can transfer between individuals and parties. And usually in some of these countries, gold is worn very clearly as your bank account. You have it as jewelry, you have it as other things. You know, you go to India, for example, you go to a number of other countries, you will find these. So the price of gold is normally been correlated to risk. So the more volatile the world economy is and the more the exchange rate fluctuates, the more it is likely that the gold price will go up as a response to demand. It is very difficult to predict because it has a very high irrational component linked to it. So the answer is I cannot give any view on the gold price, and I shouldn't. But I do believe that the US dollar will be with us as a world currency for a long time, even in countries who do not like the US.
There you go. There you go. No, thanks for that. We have time for one more question. Very quick answer on this one. It's from Mikael Dahlgren. What's your take on the UK and the Swedish style salary subsidy, where the people are not allowed to work, versus Australia style job keeper, where they can work and getting subsidies?
Firstly, you want to keep people in work. That's the key thing. You don't want to educate people to have incomes and unlearn how to work. And that is why it's so difficult frequently to get people who have long-term unemployment to get back into work. They have unlearned the discipline of working. So the first thing is you do want people to work. But in order to do that, there has to be a job. There has to be something to do. I do believe that the UK furlough scheme, good as it principally is, should have been connected to a higher requirement for these people to have some form of activity in response to the money they received. And I think on the whole, because there has now been people who have not worked with an income for 3 months, and some of those people will have unlearned the discipline about working, and actually will not only find it difficult to go back, but if they become unemployed, they will find it very difficult to go into a different level of economic revenue and will not have the motivation or insight to go and drive their own job development activities. So that's the UK one and the Swedish one as well. I think the primary difference, if I may say so, between the UK and in Sweden in terms of government interaction has been not so much the type of specific programs as the speed by which they have been implemented. Sweden has shown itself as an economy to be unable to act rapidly to make decisions and implement programs. Classical example is the help to small companies, which in Sweden took a long time to decide, and by the way, is still in debate in aspects of it, and will be mostly played out in August, which is very late, and many companies will have gone under before that. UK took a decision and had it implemented and paid out within 2 weeks. The neighbors of Sweden had it implemented and paid out within a month. So Sweden, the Swedish political system has come out looking very badly in terms of its inability to take rapid decisions and make action in this process, whereas the UK system has shown itself to be able to take rapid actions. And that's one side of the story. The other side is, are the actions appropriate? And that's a separate discussion, right?
We probably will take that next time that you are online then.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I would say thank you so much, Göran. It's been a fantastic pleasure for us to listen to your facts, figures, and the way of presenting it, making it very enjoyable, interesting, I should say. Thank you so much. I'll leave it up to you, Camilla, to wrap this up. And hope to see you soon back out flying or coming back to Australia. Maybe you will see you
when you open up.
Yeah, that's right. We're hoping that we will have you here in November. We will have some sessions going on in WA here. So you're welcome then. Thanks a lot, Göran. Camilla, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Göran, and thank you everybody else for listening this afternoon. I'm just going to show very quickly our upcoming events. So I'm just sharing this slide here. So our next event is on the 23rd of July at 4 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time. And that's going to be about digital marketing. And it's one of our members, Meyer Strategic Digital Marketing, who is hosting this event in their venue, at their office in Manly. And we will have representatives from Google and Facebook there, and also a representative from IKEA, who works very closely with them. That's the 23rd of July. Then we have an event coming up on the 20th of August, which will be an online event. And here we are focusing on entrepreneurs. So many of our members are entrepreneurs. And this is more of a smaller event, which is going to be focused on experience sharing when it comes to partnership. And our aim is to organize about 4 of these online events per year. And that's especially aimed then towards the smaller companies and entrepreneurs. And then on the 16th of September, it's a save the date. We're doing our SACC annual executive forum in Melbourne. And that event is going to also be open up to all members. Follow the executive forum. There will be an event for all members as well. Please keep an eye on our socials, LinkedIn and Facebook, and our website. There will be a regular announcement and lots of changes according to restrictions. So we are planning some face-to-face events as well, but at the moment it's majority online events still. You can also find all the recent events and webinars on our website. There is summaries and also recordings available there. And contact us or visit the website again for any information and membership. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you on the 23rd, in a month's time, on the 23rd of July.